Hello, thanks for joining me for a pre-concert talk. This next weekend, the Maryland Symphony will be completing its 40th anniversary season with a classics concert celebrating the life of Gabrielle Pierne. Pierne was a formidable musical presence in the first third of the 20th century in Paris. He was a mover and shaker. He was a great conductor, a teacher, a composer, and one of his distinguished presences was at Saint-Clotilde Cathedral as their titulaire or primary organist. These many different roles made a picture of a musician, a complete musician, one who is comfortable composing in all the genres of music, whether it be opera, chamber music, symphonic music, ballet. He could write it all, and he did. We will be featuring his beautiful Concertstück or concert piece for harp and orchestra in the center of our concert. But we begin with probably one of the works with which Gabrielle Pierne is associated at the highest level, and that is Igor Stravinsky's Firebird ballet. Pierne conducted the premiere of this great work. This must have been, well, it was historic even when it happened. I think everyone knew that something special had arrived to the world of music and, of course, the world of ballet as well. Igor Stravinsky, in order to make the music that he wrote more well-known, reduced the ballet score to an orchestral suite in 1911. And this used all of the massive forces that he called for in his ballet. Lots of extra instruments, a huge orchestra that was quite common at that point in the history of orchestras. This was before the First World War, where many of the great orchestral musicians perished, after which there was a great rebuilding and you look at the music of Stravinsky, his orchestrations are pared down sometimes to just a few players in order to continue the life of a musician and continue music on after the horrific World War. But this is before the World War. This is at a time when art and music is centered in Paris. Some of the most exciting musical events are happening in Paris around this time. Gabrielle Pierne, one of the great conductors of his time, was essential in bringing forth new works. For me, he is a role model. He is someone who was aware of his time, wanted to promote the voices, the talented voices of his time, as well as contribute as a performer and also as a composer. The Firebird by Stravinsky tells the story. I think it is a mishmash of a few folk tales that were kind of joined. An evil sorcerer who kidnapped princesses that needed to be, was kind of not a Beauty and the Beast, but a kind of tale of intrigue and evil versus good, a young prince who comes to the rescue, and also the tale of the Firebird itself, the phoenix that sort of in its death rises again. If you know Harry Potter, you know that one of the great figures of the stories is Professor Dumbledore, whose animal is a phoenix. And so we see that animal burn up and then rise again to the wonderment of young Harry Potter. One wonders if this fairy tale didn't affect J.K. Rowling in some ways as well, as we'll see in a little bit. But the Firebird was reduced to a suite, and then a few years later in 1919, reduced or changed a bit. The 1911 version of the suite tells the story from the beginning and sort of abruptly stops sort of at the climax of the ballet and doesn't give us a sense of the end. We have a sense of the beautiful bird and a lot of the princesses, the music of the princesses and the prince's interaction with them, but we don't really know how the story ends. So in 1919, the suite, which was revised for a slightly smaller orchestra, so it could be more easily performed on a concert stage, tells the entire story from the very beginning. We encounter immediately the enchanted garden of the sorcerer king Koschei. And the prince encounters the Firebird. We hear the Firebird, the sparks of its wings, the energy and the beauty of it. We also encounter the princesses, which the prince, of course, has to fall in love with at least one of them, and he does, and resolves to free them from the enchantment of the evil sorcerer. But he also catches the Firebird and seeks to keep her to himself. And she begs for freedom, and she promises with the gift of one of her feathers to him that should he be in dire need, she would come to him again. So he releases her. And as he tries to free the princesses, of course, this awakens all the minions of the evil sorcerer, and they rise up in this incredible battle dance. It is the high point of the suite, and it is where the first suite ends, and it is the climax of the second suite, which then resolves into the end of the story, which contains some of the most beautiful music. When the prince is confronted by all these wildly dancing creatures who are attacking him, he, of course, calls with the feather, he calls upon the magic Firebird to come to his rescue. And what she does is sing a lullaby, or berceuse, which puts both the sorcerer and all of his creatures to sleep so that the prince and the princess can steal away to freedom. But in order for this never to happen again, the Firebird has told the secret of the sorcerer to the prince, for his soul, which allows him immortality, has been hidden in a golden egg that's cached away somewhere. And the Firebird tells the prince the location of this magic egg. And so for those of you who know Harry Potter and some of the terminology, think Horcrux. Once the prince discovers the egg and destroys it, that destroys the sorcerer and his entire enchanted kingdom. The prince is allowed to go forth in glory with his beloved princess. So all works out beautifully. The music is tremendous. It gives us that sense of enchantment and foreboding at the very, very beginning, with low instruments intoning this repetitive, magical incantation at the very beginning. We hear the sparks of the Firebird. We hear the somewhat melancholy dance of the princesses in the next movement. It is not a happy, light springing dance, but rather one in which one senses that these princesses must be under a spell and are not happy about it. The marvelous dance of the King Koschei and his minions is well known. If you listen very carefully to the first few notes, you realize it's a truncated version of the Dies Irae theme, which has taken form in many requiems and also in the music of Rachmaninoff. This was a liturgical chant that would be well known to the listeners in Paris. And of course, it gives a sense of the dark world, death, and something sinister in it. The syncopated rhythms are such that they're not regular. They are something that pushes forward, that gives energy and gives life to these dark forces. Maybe think of Darth Vader's march as well, the way that this incessant rhythm propels something forward and propels the darkness of it along with it. The berceuse gives an opportunity for our principal horn player, Joseph Levinsky, who is retiring after this concert from the orchestra, whose many years of service have been distinguished by brilliant play, and we will miss him greatly. This gives him a chance to shine in one of the more beautiful solos in the orchestral repertoire. And then, of course, the marvelous chorale-like ending, triumphant ending that features all of our brass instruments in all their glory. Stravinsky was just at the beginning of his career. For Gabrielle Pierne, this must have been a highlight for him. He was already an established musician, conductor, highly thought of as a teacher and as a performer. And we will now turn to his role as a composer in the next work, his Concertstück for harp and orchestra. It is a piece that falls into three sections. One is an opening section with really two main themes, followed by a more dance-like or chorale-like section, the melody of which reminds me a lot of the music of Gabrielle Fauré. If you know Fauré's Requiem, you'll hear some of the similar, almost liturgical, perhaps harmonic progressions. Certainly, they must have been in the air at the time when this was being written. And this beautiful second section, which is in 3/4 time, but sounds more like it could come as a chorale, is followed by a more scherzo or virtuosic theme that's very much connected to the chorale theme as well. And in the end, all of these are combined and presented together in a way that will be, in a way that harkens back to the Symphony in D minor by César Franck, the composer of the final work on our program. But before we go, let's talk more about Pierne with the soloist for this program, Madeline Olson. I had the opportunity to speak with her earlier this week, and she had lots to say about this marvelous work.
I'm joined now by Madeline Olson. She will be playing Gabrielle Pierne's Concertstück, Opus 39 for harp and orchestra. Madeline, thank you so much for joining us. First of all, you're coming to us almost at a last minute on a few weeks' notice to fill in for Sarah Fuller, who had to withdraw from our concert. But we're so happy that you have agreed to join us. I never in a million years thought that our discussions about the piece when I was in Buffalo a few weeks back would result in this collaboration, but I am so delighted that you agreed to join us. It is a piece that you happen to love a lot. And for me personally, Gabrielle Pierne is a personal hero of mine. He forms the centerpiece of this program. And also, of course, he gave the premiere of the Firebird Ballet, and his teacher was Franck. So the concert is really built around this marvelous musical personality who was both a fantastic composer and a conductor and a teacher, all things that most musicians aspire to, at least on some level, but he seemed to master all three of them. He was a complete musician, in other words. So I know you love this piece, and I'm going to sort of turn it over to you to discuss why this is a special piece to you. And when you first, I would love to know when you first learned it, and how does Gabrielle Pierne's music fit into the world of harp?
Mm-hmm. So most harpists know Pierne for two things, this piece and a little solo piece called Impromptu Caprice. And every young harpist learns this solo piece. It's one of the foundations of solo repertoire for young students. And even if they don't know the Concertstück, they definitely know the Impromptu Caprice. I learned it when I think I was about 12 when I learned it. And it's a really beloved little work. And I think what's so interesting about Pierne and his approach to the harp is just how complete his understanding of the instrument is as a non-harpist, as someone who really didn't spend a whole lot of time invested into the instrument, into harpists in general. But it's very clear that whoever he studied with, whatever harpist he worked with, provided him with a really comprehensive knowledge of how the instrument works, its little idiosyncrasies. And I think the Concertstück is a really good example of that. He uses the full range of the instrument right from the very beginning of the piece. There's these sweeping arpeggios that go all up and down the instrument, and you really get a full sense of the colors that the harp can produce. And he uses what some might consider to be a little bit of a weakness of the instrument to its full advantage. The harp has a very immediate attack sound, and there's no real way to sustain a pitch once it's plucked. And so there's not that same ability to kind of manipulate a melody, to have a phrase really just continue to sing or crescendo within a single note. So the way that Pierne approaches this, and he has some beautiful melody lines in the Concertstück, and he makes this illusion of sustained melody by kind of hiding the melody line in this really intricate filigree of arpeggios and chords. And I think it's really, really effective.
That's ingenious, actually. It's just spectacular. Sometimes I also think that he helps, in terms of the orchestration, can help support that as well. The orchestra extremely supportive in its role, I think, in this way. It of course has some of the major thematic materials, and it bursts forth occasionally, but it is mostly supportive in the best way, I think. It's not taking back seat exactly. It's much more collaborative. I think it's a journey that both are going in the same direction. There's not a lot of combative, unless it's playful, combative relationship, really. Or maybe you have a call and response kind of situation occasionally, but it's clearly he loves the instrument. It is the most magic instrument. I know everyone says that, it's very cliche, but once you hear that harp, there is something so remarkable about that instrument. And the idea of him being able to master that as a composer shows his extreme well training. Obviously, in France, the harp, of course, was a very important instrument. I think it probably goes back at least to the 19th century, where it must have been perfected. It seems to me that most of the harp, it's either Italy or France, some of the best instruments. You could fill me in on this. Some of the best French or harps made are French. Is that right, or are they in a different?
So there's two main harp makers now. France has always been, of course, a bastion for the harp, and Camac is the big harp maker in France, and in the US actually is the other premier harp maker, Lyon and Healy, which actually I have written up.
Okay, yes, I forgot about Lyon and Healy. That's out of Chicago or something, isn't it?
Yes,
yes, right. Yes, I shouldn't ever say that, but I remember when I was in the National Symphony as a associate conductor, the harpist there was Doriane Lavalier, who's a spectacular player, but she would always present to composers and conductors something that she had compiled about how to write for the harp. And it was like a little workbook, and how to notate for a harp, and what are the possibilities. She just, I think she was hoping to commission works, and she did, in fact. but also wanted all of us to kind of understand the intricacies of the instrument, which is still in some ways still challenging for me when I'm reading a score and I see the changes that you have to do in terms of all the footwork, the pedaling. And sometimes the pedaling looks as if it's contrary to the actual key of the piece, but a lot of it is enharmonic spelling. In other words, you know, it actually brings us into the right key, but you have to retune certain, it's so complicated. I'm afraid to even describe it because I think it would be wrong, but there's a mystery to it all. And I know Dottie Ann wanted to make it a little bit easier so that composers would feel more comfortable. I don't know whether it is something that is introduced in composition scores, composition classes. I would imagine that it is at a master's level or something like that when it comes to orchestration. But it probably is one of the later issues that people come to, unless they play the instrument. So I'm just in awe of what you can do and how you're able to make something that looks like it would just be from high to low, somehow be able to play in several different keys. And if you could talk just a little bit about the physicality of that instrument.
Yeah, absolutely. So, like you mentioned, something that not everyone is aware of is the fact that the modern harp has 7-foot pedals. And so there's one pedal for each note on the musical scale. And those pedals each have 3 notches for flat, natural, and sharp. So there's a mechanism that comes up through the column here, and you can see some of the mechanism on this side, and it tightens and loosens the strings so that I can play in different keys, so that I can play accidentals and play almost chromatically. There are still some limitations to exactly how chromatically I can play, but it really opens up the possibilities instead of just having strings that I then have to retune every time I change keys. So yeah, there really is a lot going on while I'm playing. And the footwork especially is, there's a lot of it in the Pierne. Like you mentioned, the enharmonic changes between keys, respellings of notes. So I'm playing what sounds like one pitch, but I'm playing it on a different string. That happens really frequently in harp music. And that's what allows some of these really harp specific like sounds that you can't really recreate on other instruments. Being able to play the same pitch on 2 different strings, being able to play like pentatonic scales and glissandi and stuff like that. But yeah, when I am approaching a piece like this, there's just kind of an aspect of study where obviously you have to have an awareness of what's going on below you at your foot level, and you there's no visual aspect to that. There's a lot of memory. And you just kind of have to always have an awareness of which pedals are where and where they need to go, and how that plays into what harmonies you are producing with your fingers. So,
I mean, the practicing, you're talking about all 4 limbs in action at all times,
yes.
basically. You know, your feet are moving to create the notes, as I'm a violinist, so it would be like my left hand, but that your feet are your left hand.
Yeah.
And the bow, which creates the sound, you know, that's your hands making that. I find it just remarkable and fantastic. And it is such a great instrument. And do you know much about the history of it? I'm assuming that when this piece was written in 1901, that the instrument itself had achieved a certain level of modernism, perfection, technically, or was it still to go? Where there's still changes to be made? Are there things that in the piece happened because the instrument wasn't quite perfected yet, so he was having to make do? Or is this a piece that really celebrates an instrument at the top of its virtuosic possibility?
I think this form of the harp, it's interesting that you asked that, because around the turn of the century, there was there were kind of two competing versions of the concert harp. There's the version that you see here, which is the pedal harp, and there was what was called the chromatic harp, which instead of pedals had two rows of strings that crossed in the middle, and they were tuned like the keys of a piano. And in order to play accidentals, you would reach through and grab the other row of strings, and it was just insanely heavy and complicated, even more so than this version. And so around the turn of the century, there was like the harp makers kind of had this war going on promoting their instruments, and piece like the WC dances was actually written for the chromatic harp, and the Ravel introduction and allegro was written for this pedal harp too, and they were kind of competing pieces, showing this instrument is the better version, this instrument is the better version. And the chromatic harp, thankfully, did not really catch on. It was about 130 pounds and very unwieldy. And pieces that were written for that were eventually transcribed over to this instrument. But Pierne's work was written specifically for the pedal harp, and in its final stage as an instrument. There was a period of about 150 years where the pedal mechanisms were being developed and experimented with. And originally there was just one notch for the pedals, so it was even less chromatic. But the modern version with the three pedal positions is the version that Pierne wrote it for, and it's clear that he knew how to make the most of the possibilities there.
Well, we know he wrote it, and the name has escaped me at this moment, of course, and I don't have my score in front of me, but he dedicated it or wrote it for the person I believe was one of the leading harpists of the time in Paris, and perhaps the teacher at the Conservatoire.
I believe it was written for Henriette Renier, who was one of the
really?
premier, or she premiered it, I believe, actually.
Oh, a woman. Oh, fantastic. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. Fantastic.
She was actually the first woman to graduate from the Paris Conservatoire.
Fantastic. Wow.
Really an incredible person.
Wow, and I'm sure she is one of the pioneers of the technique and of teaching. Did she teach at the Conservatoire, or was she even allowed to? I don't know at that point.
I believe that she did. She actually graduated from the Conservatoire for composition.
Oh, for goodness sake.
Yeah, she was a composer in her own right, and actually a lot of the fundamental pieces in our concert repertoire are composed by her. And there's a direct lineage of teachers traced back to her. Two of the main schools of teaching. There's about two or three generations that go directly back to her.
And that's so fascinating to me because as a violinist, I can go back probably 300 years or so to teachers or techniques or schools of playing. And in the harp, it's much more modern, it's much more recent. Of course, we can go back to medieval and probably super ancient times in terms of the lyre and all of those things. But in terms of the modern harp technique, that it's really from the 20th century or maybe late 19th century onward that you actually can trace your pedagogical lineage, right? That's fantastic, and you can actually know something about the teachers. Your teacher probably studied with someone who studied with her, or even if you had a really old teacher, maybe back, all the way back to the 1930s if she was still around. It is so wonderful because it reminds us of how music is taught, which is from person to person. It's a much more personal thing. Surely we have textbooks and things that keep us doing our etudes and pieces of music that develop us as artists, but it really is about the actual making of it with a teacher who is making the music, with a teacher who has helped them make the music, and it just goes back. Do you have students of your own? Do you have time to teach? I know you're very, very busy with the Buffalo Philharmonic.
I actually don't have any students currently. I'm actually only a few years out of school myself.
Congratulations.
Thank you. So I think teaching is something that eventually I would love to do, but I think
Mhm.
I have more to learn individually as
Cool.
well before I get there. So
I mean, well, now you're immersed probably week to week with a major orchestra, a wonderful orchestra, and learning the repertoire. Not learning, because I'm sure you've already learned most of the repertoire, at least in terms of your studies and preparation. Coming out of school is a different thing than, you know, just doing it now, being in the orchestra and being with your colleagues. Many of them have played the pieces before, conductors have conducted them before, so you're gaining their experience as well now. And also, can you tell us, it's just a couple years out of school, which is amazing. It just shows us the level of where students are now emerging from conservatory. Of course, we expect um, everyone to be, you know, fully formed and all of that, but it isn't always the case. But in your case, it seems to be that you have stepped right into a plum job. There aren't that many openings for harpists to play professionally with orchestras, I would imagine. And I might be wrong about that, but it seems to me that what you have is a coveted job. Is that so?
that is correct. I'm very fortunate to be where I am. There are very few principal harp positions, full time, especially in the States and around the world, actually. So anytime a position opens, it's a really big deal.
What is it like? I know you have been experiencing playing in an orchestra, and you probably have done that for quite a while, whether you were at conservatory or even before that. But what is it like when you are a soloist with an orchestra? I mean, that's a very different experience, I would imagine.
I think the difference between being inside the orchestra playing and being in front of the orchestra playing is, for me at least, mainly how I think about my sound and how I want my instrument to project and come out, and what things I want to highlight. Um, I think the harp in the orchestra tends to have more of a soloist role to begin with. So there's not um, such a huge transition, I'd say, between other instruments playing orchestrally and playing as a soloist. But I think the thing that I have to adapt to when I play as a soloist is, while in orchestra, like, yes, the harp has many prominent parts, but many of them are accompanying other instruments and is playing a supportive role. So I have to kind of fight my instinct to accompany the orchestra when I play as a soloist.
That is, yeah, I was going to say that really makes sense in terms of often it's a certain enhancement of a texture or a special moment in a piece
Right.
of music where the harp enters, and then all of a sudden everything is transformed. But to see it right in front, I think the audience, when they see you play, will be just astonished at the sound that you create, but how it happens and how you make that, how you evoke it with your entire, literally, hands and feet in action, as well as head and heart, of course. But we're really looking forward to this very special piece of music, which epitomizes a certain time in music history, but also a certain moment when the harp becomes a really not only majestic instrument, but a thoroughly realized instrument of virtuosity and you know, every possibility musically when it comes to technique, but also the people that were playing it at the time. And now we come to the next century, the 21st century, and we have a new modern virtuoso coming to play with us. So we're really looking forward to your collaboration with the Maryland Symphony Orchestra, Madeline. Thank you again for spending some time with us to talk about yourself and the instrument and the Pierne Concertstück.
Thank you for having me. I'm so looking forward to joining you.
As you heard, Madeleine Olson fresh out of Juilliard to capture one of the great coveted positions, orchestral harpist, right out of school is quite extraordinary. She is an extraordinary musician, and it will be exciting to be able to collaborate with her. I had the pleasure of working with her a few weeks ago with the Buffalo Philharmonic, and I know already that you're in for a treat. She is a delight as a person and quite extraordinary as a young artist. Now we move to Pierne's teacher. Pierne studied the organ and with César Franck, and actually succeeded César Franck into the grand titulaire position of organist at the Cathedral of Sainte-Clotilde in Paris. This was a very prestigious appointment, and made famous really by César Franck, who brought the world of French organ performance to the world and really established what we know as the modern tradition. The instrument, the pipe organ in France, was lifted to its highest level in the 19th century by Cavaillé-Coll, who was an ingenious, a genius in mechanical works, as well as obviously an incredible ear and love for music. He understood this fantastic instrument and made it into its own symphonic world. With many, many more stops and pipes, he improved upon what was already there in a way that has never really been bettered. Perhaps there are new electronic techniques that make the sounds more powerful or maybe a little bit more accurate. But in truth, the great instruments that are in many of the cathedrals in Paris were built by him and remain the epitome of the instrument. In fact, if you want to hear some of that, you can go onto YouTube and hear one of the great organists of today, Sophie Véronique Chauchefer-Chopin. She is the titulaire organist at Saint-Sulpice Cathedral. I have never heard her live, but whenever I go on YouTube, I search her out because she is a remarkable, remarkable artist, a genius, and improvises miraculously. And it is César Franck who really brought that idea of the French organist as an improviser, as someone who can spin minutes and hours of music from a singular theme or a series of themes. And in some ways, César Franck's Symphony in D minor is an example of a composer spinning out what in some ways is a grand improvisation. It's cast over 3 movements, but it does look back to the form, the Germanic form of the symphony, which sets out themes and developments and has contrasting movements, a dance movement, a slow movement, a virtuosic, triumphant ending, finale of some sort. And with the first movement being perhaps the most complicated, a working out of themes, a presentation, and asking the big questions that might have some solutions in the following movements. In this case, because it's cast in 3 movements, we still hear in the second movement a bit of a slow song-like aria, and then followed by a little bit of a scherzo treatment of that. But in truth, all of this music that Franck wrote comes from the very, very beginning of the piece, this enormous kind of Hamlet to be or not to be statement, Shakespearean statement at the very beginning by the basses and the cellos. It descends and then comes up as if it is a question. Many people see this piece as somewhat gloomy and typical of late 19th century French art, but as far as I'm concerned, I find it much more theatrical. It doesn't have a program, and indeed, when Franck was asked about this symphony, does it have a program? What does it mean? He said, it's just music, it's pure music. And indeed, it is the mind of this great composer who asks a question and has to ask it again. It's an unusual beginning in that we have a slow introduction followed by what seems to be the allegro section. But then it stops and he goes back in almost verbatim, repeats the slow section again. What this does, however, is immediately connect the music of the allegro to what was given to us at the very beginning. And he brings the listener along to say, do you see the connections, these first three notes from the beginning that were asked in a questioning way, in a perhaps even a yearning way or an upward way, looking up. The rigor of the allegro has those same three notes, but now in a much more vigorous way, in one which is going to propel us forward. So he brings us back to the beginning in order to make sure that we understand the connection between the adagio section and the allegro section. And then after the second iteration of the introductory slow section, we are propelled into a very long allegro, which has several themes, but which is going to present all the music that we're going to hear for the rest of the symphony, albeit in a varied form. I find it that this expression of this man, he doesn't necessarily use the form of symphony or the symphonic first movement, the sonata form in the way that we expect, which is one theme followed by a contrasting theme, and that is developed over time. Everything evolves, just like he would do as he would improvise on the organ. It all organically moves and develops. And he goes, one of the great things he said to his students was modulate, modulate, modulate. When it came to development, the idea was to grow harmonically, to see the connections from one key to the next, using one note that has a certain meaning in one key and becomes important in another. But we hear that same note, so we have a sense of what we can hold on to. I think that's what's so brilliant about Franck's music, is that for the listener, he always gives you something to hold on to. There is never, it's not that it's not surprising, it's more that it's delighting, because you see the connections, he gives you something to hold on to, you see the connection, and all of a sudden you're in a new harmonic world. The colors, the possibilities that's what's exciting about it. The idea of something always over the ridge, always going to happen, something that constantly is evolving. And when you finally return to home keys, to keys that we began with, you've gone through such a journey and you've heard all of the themes in different relationships, sometimes in bright keys, dark keys. This is the magic of music. And these are the colors, and this is the relationships of harmonies. That is the magic of the language of music. And in some ways, this is Franck saying, I can tell you any story, and I can tell it to you with pure music. You don't need to know that there's a prince or a princess or a happy ending or a sad ending. This is the possibility of music right here in front of you. And it allows you to go through a journey, a process of discovery, a process of movement that has nothing to do with words and everything to do with music itself. The second movement has a beautiful song, and it's sung by the English horn. Surprisingly, when it was first performed, many Parisian listeners took offense that an English horn would have such an important role in a symphony. They seem to have forgotten that Hector Berlioz, 70 years prior, had already done this in his marvelous pastoral movement of his Symphonie Fantastique, given the English horn an important role. But we join not only the English horn, but we have the presence of the harp as well. And it creates something of such beauty and gracefulness. And then it is spun into these shadowy scherzo-like figures of the tremolo strings. It gives us a sense of something slow and stately, typical of a symphonic movement, and something that is agitated and light and Mendelssohnian in its scherzo-like magic. Certainly, at this point, at the end of the 19th century, the music of Wagner and the music of Mendelssohn are both popular and well known. And so that scherzo feeling, the magic feeling of Mendelssohn, you can sense in this, the treatment of the strings in this second central music movement by Franck. But you can also hear, of course, all of the wonderful harmonic progressions that owe much to the music of Liszt and of Wagner as well. In the third movement, we have something that is extremely uplifting, a melody that lifts us up, but it comes directly from the more stately melody of the second movement. If you listen carefully, you can hear the connection. He's just changed, sort of changed the mood. And we have something that is, again, it's going to propel us forward. It's going to be it's bright. It is more cheerful and positive, perhaps, than some of the more melancholy or darkness of previously. But he is going to ingeniously bring back the music of the second movement, but also the music of the first in this final movement, where he combines the main themes of the first and second movements into the third to show us, again, this is the French musician, the epitome of the improviser, the sense of being able to take themes from prior movements or from earlier movements and show you how it all fits together. And indeed he does. You hear one of the marvelous things he does is this idea of recollection, where in the second movement, but in the third movement especially, where he and also in the first movement, he stops the music and we hear a little bit of one of the instruments sort of recalling or re-emphasizing a little tidbit of a melody or a cadence, something that slows the music and allows for reflection. And I always think of this as the composer going, now what have we here? What have we done? Let us remind ourselves where we have come from, and now where can we go to push us forward in this thought. And you hear this throughout the symphony. This is, I think, one of the most audience-friendly works, and it has nothing to do with, it's not dumbed down in any way. It is not sentimental in any way. It is not trying to be attractive for attractiveness sake. This is a composer who is also a teacher, and he is teaching his listeners how to hear his music, how to hear his process. But at the same time, because he is this immense genius, from the very beginning, these questioning notes in the bass are given its answer in its glorious end, which literally takes us into another place, transcends for the listener, gives us a journey that really is sweeping and quite substantial. But at the same time, we have someone who is willing to walk with us all the way and make sure that we can appreciate the magic and the importance of the art of music and all of the possibilities in its simple building blocks and what that can turn into. It becomes an immense prism in which we see all the colors, all the possibilities. It's really, for me, there's no reason why this is, we call it a warhorse piece, but I think in some ways it continues to be a masterwork because it shows us, it still shows us the possibilities of the power of music. I love this work. It is a work that I enjoy going back and finding new relationships, but also the challenge of keeping Franck's voice front and center and his musical ideas and the ingeniousness of the construction of this wonderful symphony always at the forefront.